At home, my parents' fights were constant, so frequent that I couldn't remember a day when silence reigned. The arguments started over trivial matters and quickly escalated to shouting and cursing. The sound of breaking objects became a familiar soundtrack. As an only child, I watched everything from a corner of the room, always trying to be invisible. My mom insisted I stay out of it, saying they were problems between her and my dad. But seeing my dad treat her like trash filled me with anger and sadness. Even so, I obeyed, feeling powerless and cowardly, watching from afar. In this chaos, I sought an escape, a way out. Whenever the tension rose and the fight seemed endless, I would leave the house. Walking through the rural area at night became my routine. The deserted streets, lit only by the pale moonlight, offered me temporary peace. Out there, with the silence of the early hours and the cold wind hitting my face, I could breathe. It didn't matter that it was midnight and that stories of dangers in the dark echoed in my mind. I needed that moment of tranquility, far from the angry voices waiting for me at home. Walking under the starry sky was the only thing keeping me sane. I counted my steps, trying not to think about what awaited me upon my return. With luck, I'd find my parents asleep, and for a few moments I could pretend everything was fine. But on that particular night, the tranquility of my walks was broken by something that would change my life forever. It was one of those nights when leaving home seemed like the only sensible option. My parents' fights had reached a peak, and the air inside the house was too heavy to breathe. So I put on a coat and left, leaving the chaos behind. The night was cold and silent, and the moonlight cast long shadows on the empty streets. As I walked, lost in my thoughts, I heard a strange sound. I stopped for a moment and looked around. In the distance, I saw a boy standing in the street. He was at least 20 yards away from me, motionless, with his hands at his sides. At first, I didn't feel afraid. On the contrary, I found the situation curious and even a bit funny. After all, who would be outside at this hour of the night? I decided to get a little closer and asked if he was lost. He didn't respond. Instead, he smiled, revealing absurdly large teeth, especially the ones in the middle. The sight of that strange smile made me chuckle a bit. What funny teeth, I thought. I continued walking, trying to ignore the oddness of the situation. But something wasn't right. Even with the distance between us, I kept hearing footsteps. I turned around again and noticed that the boy was much closer, less than 10 yards away. What was strange was that I hadn't heard any sound indicating he had quickened his pace. It was as if he had simply appeared there. A chill ran down my spine, and the memory of old stories about nighttime apparitions on the farm began to hammer in my mind. They said that if you encountered one of these entities at night, you should never smile at it. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the growing discomfort. However, the situation worsened. Each time I sped up, the boy did the same. It was making me nervous, and a strange urge to laugh began to creep over me. Every second, this urge grew stronger, as if something inside me desperately wanted to break the silence of the night with laughter. Then the boy finally spoke. His voice was high-pitched and piercing, and upon hearing it, I couldn't hold back. I let out a nervous, automatic laugh. The boy's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of hatred. At that moment, I realized that something was very, very wrong. My heart started to race as I tried to quicken my pace. The boy kept following me, mirroring my every move. The feeling of unease turned to panic when he spoke again in that high-pitched, unsettling voice. I couldn't help it and let out an involuntary laugh, quickly trying to muffle the sound with my hands. It was then that the boy's smile disappeared. His face twisted into an expression of pure hatred, and before I could react, he began to transform. His facial features vanished, his skin turned as pale as snow, and his body grew into a tall skeletal figure. His hands, once small, became long and thin, with crooked, sharp nails like claws. Terror took over, and I ran like never before. I felt the presence of that thing right behind me, getting closer and closer. No matter how fast I ran, it seemed I couldn't get away. I heard its footsteps closing in, felt its shadow covering me, and then one of its claws grazed my heel, causing me to stumble and fall onto the rocky, dirty ground. Pain shot through me as those monstrous nails dug into my chest, and I screamed, begging for it to stop. The creature was on top of me, raising its arm for a second strike. I was sure I was going to die right there on that deserted road. Then I heard the sound of doors opening, and human voices started to fill the air. Neighbors, drawn by my scream, came out of their houses to see what was happening. As soon as the first person appeared, the entity dissolved into the air like smoke. It disappeared as quickly as it had come. I lay there, my whole body trembling, my clothes covered in blood and fear. Before anyone could reach me, I passed out. When I woke up, I was at home. My wounds had been treated, and surprisingly, my parents were by my side. The trauma of the incident seemed to unite them in a way I had never seen before. The fight stopped, and they cared more about me than their own conflicts. But even with this change, the fear didn't leave me. Since that night, it took me a long time to smile again. I was terrified that if I did, that horrible thing might reappear and finish what it started. A few years ago, I decided to leave the hustle and bustle of the big city and seek a peaceful escape. I found a small, forgotten village in the heart of the United States that seemed like the perfect place to start over. The village was situated in a secluded valley, surrounded by dense forests and gentle hills. Upon arriving, I was struck by the feeling that time had stopped there. The houses were old, many of them built at the beginning of the last century, and the streets were almost always deserted. My motivation for moving was simple. I wanted peace. City life was consuming me. The incessant traffic, constant noise, and pressure of work left me exhausted. I longed for a place where I could breathe deeply and listen to the silence. The village seemed to offer just that, with its almost surreal tranquility and lack of any sign of modernity. However, from my first day in the village, I started to notice strange things. The few people I met were reserved and avoided any prolonged contact. When I tried to start a conversation, they responded with monosyllables and quickly walked away. There was an air of mystery about their behavior that intrigued me. One evening, while exploring the area around my house, I noticed that no one went near the old church in the center of the village. The building was in ruins, with broken windows and creaking doors. But what caught my attention most was the way the residents seemed to avoid it. I asked some of them about the church, but they just looked away and quickly changed the subject. It was as if the church carried a dark secret that everyone would rather forget. Furthermore, during the nights I often heard whispers carried by the wind, as if the walls of my house were filled with secrets. The whispers were low and indistinct, but they always left me uneasy. Sometimes I would see shadows moving past my window, but when I checked, there was nothing there. These strange little events started to pile up, making me increasingly suspicious and anxious. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong in that village. There was a mystery there, something the locals didn't want me to discover, but my curiosity was growing, and I knew that sooner or later I would have to investigate on my own. My curiosity about the old church in the center of the village grew every day. There was something about her that seemed to call out to me, as if I were destined to discover her secrets. One night, determined to solve the mystery, I took a flashlight, put on a heavy coat, and headed to the abandoned church. Approaching the building, I felt an inexplicable cold, a feeling that seemed to penetrate to the bones. The church was in disrepair, its walls covered in ivy and moss, and the shattered windows let in the icy night breeze. The door, made of solid wood, was ajar, creaking ominously in the wind. With a mixture of apprehension and determination, I pushed the door and entered. The inside of the church was even darker than I expected. Beams of flashlight danced across walls covered in cobwebs and dust. The air was heavy and thick, as if no one had set foot there for a long time. Walking cautiously, I approached the altar. It was then that I noticed the strange symbols drawn on the ground around him. They were symbols that I had never seen before, full of geometric shapes and figures that looked like they had been drawn with some kind of thick, dark ink. In the center of the symbols, there were human bones arranged in a ritualistic way. The air became even colder, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Suddenly, the whispers started. They were low, barely audible, but clearly present. They seemed to come from all directions at once, as if the walls themselves were whispering ancient secrets. I raised the flashlight and saw shadows moving along the walls, even though there was no one there but me. My heart started to beat faster, and the feeling of being watched became more intense. The church door, which I had left open, closed with a deafening bang, making me jump in fright. The sound echoed off the walls, increasing the feeling of isolation and despair. The evil presence was undeniable now. I felt something cold and dark around me, as if it were enveloping me, watching my every move, waiting for the right time to attack. I knew I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible, but as I turned to run, I felt an invisible pressure holding me back, as if icy hands were holding me in place. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to get closer and closer. I used all my willpower to free myself from that oppressive feeling and ran towards the door. I pushed her hard and she finally gave in. I ran out of the church, my heart beating wildly. When I finally got home, I was panicking, but I knew I needed to tell the residents what I had seen. I couldn't ignore what was happening in that village, and maybe they could help me understand what I had just experienced. I ran out of the church, my heart beating wildly and my mind in a whirlwind. The cold and evil presence still seemed to follow me, as if I were being watched at every step. I arrived at the house of one of the residents, knocking loudly on the door, begging them to let me in. When the door finally opened, I breathlessly recounted everything I had seen and felt in the church. The residents' faces turned pale. They looked at each other with an expression of fear and resignation, as if they knew exactly what I was talking about. Finally, one of the older ones, his voice shaking, began to explain. Centuries ago, a group of cultists had established themselves in the village and performed a dark ritual in the church, imprisoning the souls of the inhabitants within it. Since then, these souls roamed the village, seeking revenge on anyone who dared disturb their rest. The story scared me even more. I knew I needed to leave the village immediately. I hurriedly grabbed my things and got into the car, determined to leave that cursed place behind. However, when I started driving, I noticed that the roads seemed to go on forever. No matter how much I drove, I never managed to leave the same place. It was as if he was trapped in an endless nightmare. As I drove, the voices of the dead echoed around me, whispering promises of eternal suffering and despair. Time seemed to never pass, and the road in front of me continued to stretch on, with no end in sight. Every turn seemed to take me back to where I started. The feeling of imprisonment was overwhelming. Desperate, I tried every possible route, but they all led back to the village. The voices became louder and clearer, and I could feel the dark presences all around me, watching me and waiting for the right moment to capture me. The village, with its curse, seemed determined to never let me go. I am writing this report as a warning. If you find this message, never go to that forgotten village. The apparent tranquility hides a deep and ancient evil. I don't know if I'll ever make it out of here, but I hope my warning can save someone from the same fate. Stay away from that village, or you might never leave there either. When I inherited my grandparents' farm in the interior of the United States, I thought it would be the perfect refuge to start my life over. I remember arriving for the first time and being greeted by a vast expanse of open fields and the sweet smell of freshly cut hay. The house, although old, had a welcoming rustic charm, and the barn, despite being old, seemed sturdy and full of stories. In the first few days, I spent my time exploring every corner of the property, imagining what it would be like to live there away from the hustle and bustle of the city. Everything seemed peaceful during the day, but as night fell, a strange feeling came over me. The animals were beginning to get restless, especially the horses in the barn who were neighing and moving nervously. This made me uncomfortable, but I attributed the animals' agitation to the process of adapting to my presence. The first night I went to bed exhausted, but sleep didn't come easily. There was something about the stillness of the night that felt heavy, almost suffocating. It was then that I heard the first whispers. Faint and indistinct, they seemed to come from outside, but I couldn't identify where exactly. Initially, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but the whispers continued night after night, becoming more and more disturbing. One afternoon, I decided to clean the attic of the house. I climbed the creaky wooden stairs and began rummaging through the dusty boxes and old furniture. That's when I found an old trunk hidden in a dark corner. Curious, I opened it, and at the bottom, I found an old diary with pages yellowed with age. As I leafed through it, I realized that it belonged to the previous owner of the farm, long before my grandparents. The diary pages were filled with descriptions of macabre events and strange rituals performed in the farm's fields. There were reports of shadowy figures appearing at night, muttering incomprehensible words, and drawings of symbols I had never seen before. My discomfort turned into a chill down my spine as I read more about these figures and the rituals that were supposedly performed to appease something ancient and dark. From that moment on, my view of the farm changed completely. The tranquility I felt during the day was quickly replaced by a sense of fear and despair at night. I knew I needed to understand more about what was happening there, but each new discovery only increased my uneasiness and fear. That night I was woken up by screams. Jumping out of bed, I felt my heart race as I ran to the front door. When I opened the door, the sight I saw left me petrified. Shadowy figures moved among the shadows, surrounded by an oppressive aura of evil. Their movements were slow and meticulous, as if they were conducting some kind of sinister ritual. With my heart pounding, I decided to approach silently to get a better look at what was happening. The full moon illuminated the field, revealing a circle of hooded figures, whispering incomprehensible words in a language I had never heard before. The air was thick and cold, and I could feel an evil presence around me. It was then that I saw the sinister figure. She stood out among the others, tall and imposing. His eyes glowed with an intense, almost unearthly shine, and a sinister smile spread across his pale face. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he looked at me, as if he knew exactly who I was and why I was there. For a moment I felt frozen with fear, unable to look away from those piercing eyes. The vision of this figure haunted me for days, and every time I closed my eyes I saw that menacing smile. Determined to understand what was happening, I delved into the remaining pages of the diary, searching for any clue that could explain recent events. It was then that I found an entry that mentioned the true history of the farm. I discovered that the farm had been built on an ancient Indian burial ground, a sacred site that should have been left alone. However, the former owners, driven by greed and ignorance, disrespected the sacred ground and built the farm. Since then, the spirits of the dead were troubled, unable to rest. The rituals described in the diary were desperate attempts by the former residents to appease these spirits. However, something had gone terribly wrong. Instead of bringing peace, the rituals only intensified the spirits' wrath, making them increasingly vengeful and dangerous. The sinister figure I saw seemed to be the embodiment of this wrath, a powerful and malevolent spirit, determined to haunt anyone who dared to live on the farm. These discoveries terrified me. I realized I was dealing with forces beyond my understanding, forces that could not be controlled or appeased. The farm, which once seemed like a peaceful refuge, was now a living nightmare, where each night brought new horrors and new revelations. I knew I needed to find a way to escape, but with each passing night, I felt more and more trapped, surrounded by whispers and screams that echoed through the dark farm nights. The supernatural events began to intensify. Each night brought new manifestations of terror. The barn, once just a peaceful space, was now the scene of screams that echoed until dawn. The shadows moved on their own, taking on grotesque shapes that slid across the walls of the house. Whispers rose in volume, turning into agonized screams that kept me awake, fear gripping my heart like an iron fist. I found myself increasingly powerless, trapped in an invisible prison that the farm had become. The animals were in a constant state of agitation, reflecting my own desperation. I tried to get help, but every time someone approached the property, they were repelled by an inexplicable force. Friends and acquaintances began to avoid me, perhaps sensing the evil presence that now inhabited the farm. The sinister figure I had seen that fateful night continued to haunt me. His bright eyes and evil smile were burned into my mind, and whenever I dared to look out the window at night, I felt his gaze fixed on me, watching my every move. The psychological terror was unbearable. I felt increasingly isolated, sanity slowly slipping away from me. In one of my desperate attempts to find answers, I went back to the diary. I recalled the history of the indigenous cemetery and the ill-fated rituals, trying to find some clue that could help me. But the more I read, the more I realized the gravity of the situation. The previous owners had sealed the farm's fate, and I was paying the price for their transgressions. There came a point where I realized there was no escape. The farm had become a living prison, where disturbed spirits exercised their absolute dominance. Every escape attempt was thwarted by forces beyond my understanding. I was condemned to live that endless nightmare, surrounded by whispers and screams that echoed through the endless nights. I am writing this as a warning to anyone who may inherit this farm in the future. If you ever find this property in your name, investigate its history before moving. What appears to be a peaceful haven can hide unspeakable horrors. Don't make the same mistake I made. Run away while you still can, before it's too late. Now, as I finish these words, the whispers are becoming screams. I know they're coming for me. My time is running out, and I have no hope of escape. This is my last warning, my last cry for help, echoing in the shadows of the farm. May no one else fall into the clutches of this curse. Let no one else live this endless nightmare. Now that you've heard my story, I hope it serves as a grim warning about the dangers that can lurk in seemingly peaceful places. Remember, the nightmare doesn't end when we wake up. If you liked this story and want to hear more terrifying stories, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave your comment below, sharing what scared you most, and if you've been through something similar. Until next time, and beware of what might be lurking in the darkness.